One time in one of his publications stated, on the basis of no evidence, it was just an assumption, stated that the texts that we have, the manuscripts that we now have, probably don't reflect the originals, that there has been a lot of changes that took place in the first century when the Gospels and Paul's letters were first written. In other words, the very first copies, and then the very first copies of the first copies. When these copies were being made in the first century, on in the second, there were all kinds of wild changes made. The evidence simply does not support that assumption. And one of the things that has caused us to doubt that scenario is the discovery that the ancient manuscripts were in use a long time. Because what we have found, thanks to archaeology hand in hand with manuscript discovery, we discover that, you know what? Manuscripts were in use 200, 300 years or longer. How's this happen? Well, at Oxyrhynchus, where 500,000 pages of text were recovered in the 1890s on into the 1920s. Well, some stratigraphy was done. And so we have libraries that have been thrown out, and we can do chronological study of these books. And what we find is that literature typically was in use 150 years to 200 years, sometimes 300 or 400 years. Now, the implications for the New Testament are obvious. If Paul wrote his letters in the 50s and 60s, if the gospel writers wrote their gospels in the 60s and 70s of the first century, and the autographs remained in use for 150 years, that takes us all the way into the early 3rd century. We have continuity from the autographs to these early copies we have. And those early copies would have had the same duration, the same longevity, which takes us right into the 4th century, where we have the complete Greek New Testament, like Codex Vaticanus or Codex Sinaiticus. And when those were written, these other papyri that you can now see in Geneva or in Dublin or wherever, they were still in existence. And so this idea that, oh, well, who knows what Paul originally wrote in his letters, or who knows what the gospel writers originally said about Jesus, there's no foundation for that kind of skepticism. This has been commented on. Fred Wissey, longtime professor at Yale, remarked one time that the stability of the Greek New Testament text is such that he considered it nothing less than a miracle.